Welcome to The Point with Anna Kasparian. I'm Anna Kasparian, and I love to refer to myself in the third person. We have a great show ahead for you guys, and we're going to talk about lots of really great topics. But before we do so, I want to apologize. I'm a little under the weather, so I might be a little low energy, but we have great hosts that are going to make up for it. We're going to talk about how we like to blame societal ills on drugs as opposed to poverty. We're also going to talk about how Republicans are still trying to make it even harder for us to vote, and Arizona is kind of leading the charge in that aspect. And also, racist mascots and team names. Are we ever really going to do anything about the Washington Redskins? We're going to have a nice discussion about that and more, but we're going to have a longer, broader discussion about the Trayvon Martin case. Jury selection has just begun, and what are the implications of that particular case? We can talk about stand your ground, we could talk about racism, lots of different interesting angles to discuss in that particular story. But before we do all of that, let's meet our great panelists. We have Professor Jody David Armour, and he is a George Soros Senior Fellow, a law professor at the University of Southern California, and author of Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, The Hidden Costs of Being Black in America. Jody, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here.
We also have Akilah Shirelles. He is the LA project manager for Question Bridge, Black Males, and a longtime LA activist for peace and against gang violence and the death penalty. Akilah, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And last but certainly not least is Bill Santiago. He is a former journalist turned comedian, the author of Pardon My Spanglish, Porque Because, and a return guest to The Point. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So let's get back to our discussion. George Zimmerman's case is now in session. Jury selection has begun, and a lot of people are questioning how this is going to play out. Let's watch a quick video explaining more, and then we'll take it to the panel.
The high-profile trial of George Zimmerman. Lawyers questioning potential jurors for a third day today. All eyes on that jury and how race could play a part in who is selected to serve.
Attorneys on both sides have been ordered to avoid discussing race. On Tuesday, a juror addressed it for them.
A lot of people have taken sides.
Right.
Tell me what you mean by that.
There seems to be a lot of people that feel Mr. Zimmerman shot Mr. Martin, or followed him, attacked him based on his race.
Several jurors talking about the sweatshirt Trayvon Martin was wearing the night he was killed. That hoodie has become a national symbol for the case.
My son dresses the same way, so we caution about that. I wear hoodies too, and he must have been cold.
In February of 2012, George Zimmerman, a white Hispanic neighborhood watchman, shot the black teen during a scuffle in the dark. Zimmerman claims it was self-defense and has pleaded not guilty.
If you're the defense, what kind of juror do you want?
I want a juror who sympathizes with my client. So I want a gun owner. I want people who've been victimized before.
If you're the prosecution, what kind of juror are you looking for?
I want those who can identify with Trayvon Martin. Certainly anyone who's ever been profiled or harassed in any way.
Now, the next stage of selection is really when the questions get tough. The lawyers are going to start grilling those jurors directly about how they feel about guns and race.
As you all can tell, race plays a gigantic role in the George Zimmerman case and in jury selection, as you guys could see from that video that we just showed you. But when it comes to stand your ground, there are some questions as to whether or not that law is being applied fairly among people that use it as their defense. So there are two particular cases that Katie Halper wrote about in Salon, and she highlighted the case of Ralph Wald, who walked into his Florida home and saw that his wife was having sex with another man. He shot and killed the other man, and his defense was, well, I stood my ground. I thought that that man was raping my wife. Now, that didn't turn out to be the case, but it didn't matter. He got off scot-free. But then there's the case of Marissa Alexander. She was a 31-year-old mother, and she was in a very abusive relationship. She was estranged from her husband, and one day she went back to their home to get some of the stuff that she left behind. She thought that he wasn't going to be there. He approached her. He admitted during court proceedings that he was planning on hitting her. She ran into the garage, grabbed a shotgun, did not shoot at him, but shot at a wall or the ceiling to scare him off. But you know what? She's going to serve 20 years in prison for doing that. So, as you can tell, Marissa Alexander, black, Ralph Wald, white. So why is it that stand your ground is not being applied evenly? Now, I want to take this to our panel, and first question actually goes to Jody. Jody, I mean, you watched that video, and you can tell that race has a big role when it comes to jury selection. Do you think that this case really does have a lot to do with race, or do you sympathize with people who are saying that the media is making this about race? That's not what this is really about.
Sure, well, it's going to be about race if race figures in reasonable people's assessment of dangerousness. If an ordinary person considers race when they're judging someone's riskiness, then the jury is going to be told, George Zimmerman should not be convicted if he acted reasonably. And so if a typical person responds to a young black strapping male with fear, with a sense of intimidation, then race is going to figure in the reasonable person analysis and will, without any stand your ground law, if you just had ordinary self-defense law. We can go back to 1986, the Bernard Goetz case, a celebrated subway vigilante, shot 4 black youth on a subway train and claimed self-defense, and he was worried about being robbed. Race figured in there as well, because the question was, would a reasonable person consider these youth threatening? And do reasonable people consider gender? Yes. Do they consider your ability or disability? Yes. Do they consider age? Yes. Well, does an ordinary person consider race in assessing someone's dangerousness? And someone like Jesse Jackson said to a black congregation in Chicago some years ago, nothing more pains me at this point in my life than to walk down the street, hear footsteps, start thinking robbery, turn around, see someone white, and feel relieved. That's Reverend Jesse Jackson to a black congregation. So that shows how race can figure in ordinary reasonableness analysis in all self-defense cases, not just in stand your ground cases.
So you'll have people, Akilah, who will make the argument that, well, look at the crime rates. Most crimes are carried out by minorities, so can you really blame people for having this fear when they see someone in their neighborhood who is either black or Latino and shouldn't necessarily be there? I mean, what would your response be to that argument?
I would say that it speaks to the larger conversation around really the danger of implicit bias. Because we live in a culture, I mean, since Manifest Destiny, that has characterized black men as either dangerous and violent or as sexual predators, and I mean, all of this type of crazy, you know, stuff that's out there. So how do people see beyond, you know, the veil that has been placed over our eyes by the culture and the conditioning in which we grew up in? So I think that that there is an argument, and the thing is that somehow we have to educate the public more so that we can drop, like, you know, these implicit biases around black men. I think that there was a report that was done not too long ago through Harvard University. It's the implicit association test that looked at you know, just random, you know, folks' perspective and perception of black men, and less than something like 20% of folks had positive images of black men and black boys, and I think that that's very telling.
Wow. So what do you feel perpetuates that type of mentality? Do you, Bill, feel like it's the mainstream media? Do you feel that it's because of crime rates? And is there something that we can do to actually fight that? Because I think a lot of these biases are subconscious. I think that people don't realize that they have this. I know every time we do stories like this on the Young Turks, people will be like, oh, you guys are still talking about racism and crying about racism. But these things exist. And Bill, I mean, what do you think we can do to kind of fight back? Where does it come from, and how can we fight back?
Well, I think that the stand your ground law just naturally lends itself to that kind of you know, in the moment assessment, because it lowers the bar for self-defense. You don't have to actually prove later on that, you know, you were under imminent threat and that's why you reacted with that kind of deadly force. You just kind of get a hunch, you know, and you can get a hunch from anything. You know, Jesse Jackson could have just shot behind him because he had a hunch before he found out that he wasn't under threat, because it was just white guys, you know. And so really, you know, and also there are certain, it's not just Florida, there's a bunch of states that are stand your ground states. And if you look at them on a map, they also happen to coincide with what we call, you know, the Yahoo states, the pro-gun states. I mean, there's a lot of overlap there. So it kind of seems like, you know, the mentality there is all, it all fits together. You know, it's not random. You don't see any stand your ground states in the Northeast. You know, and so
there are two organizations that are behind Stand Your Ground laws, and that includes ALEC and the NRA. So when you really look into those two organizations, obviously you guys know NRA is the largest gun lobby in the United States. It kind of all comes together, and it makes a lot of sense. And I love what Jody says about how you can just have regular self-defense laws. You don't need to have these Stand Your Ground laws, because as you guys know, they are not, this type of defense is not being applied evenly. And I want to give you guys actual statistics. It's one thing to just say it, but it's another thing to prove through actual statistics. So 73% of defendants claiming stand your ground who killed a black person faced no penalty at all, 73%. But let's talk about a white victim. Only 59% of those who killed a white person got off. So you're more likely to have that law work in your favor if you've killed a black person as opposed to a white person. And according to the Urban Institute, in Stand Your Ground states, when a white shooter kills black victims, 34% of the resulting homicides are deemed justifiable. Or when a black shooter kills a white victim, 3% of deaths are ruled justifiable. So that's a little problematic there because you can see that it's not being applied fairly.
But that prejudice is in the judicial system, not necessarily in the law itself. It's just that the law lends itself to that because it's funneling a lot more of those cases into the judicial system, right? I mean, it's not like it was quote unquote racist from the outset. It's just that it opens the door for that kind of thing.
Do you feel that lawmakers knew that would happen when they originally proposed these types of laws?
I don't know. I mean, the whole stand your ground thing, like even it's such an ambiguous title. You know, stand your ground. It sounds like more like a political statement than actually something that would explanatory. You know, like stand your ground. Like, hey, we can't give up any more of our. We've got a black president. The Latinos are taking over. You know, all the South Asians are winning spelling bees. We're not going to give up any more ground. We're going to stand right here and put an end to this. You know, and so I think it's sort of almost like politically philosophical law, and that's just the fact that it lands it ends up with more deaths and more and a discrepancy. A racial discrepancy in the way that those cases are judged. I don't think you could have foreseen that necessarily, but
yeah, and it's interesting because it's not just stand your ground. I mean, in New York City, you have stop and frisk, and stop and frisk targets blacks and Latinos. I mean, you look at it, the vast majority of stop and frisks have happened on black and Latino men just walking around town minding their business, and you gotta wonder, like, why is that? Is it because of a subconscious bias, or is it because these policies were put in place to target these people and make their life even more difficult than it needs to be?
I think that a lot of policy and laws are being made from the perspective of individuals who suffer the disease of racism in this country. I mean, nobody is exempt. We've all internalized, we've all drunk the Kool-Aid, and it's the lens in which we view the world through. And I think until we actually engage a really authentic and honest conversation about race and class and power dynamics, especially race in this country, we're gonna consistently see things like this happen.
And I think another thing that people don't really take into consideration enough is how big a role socioeconomic status plays in these discussions. Because you have people like O.J. Simpson, and O.J. Simpson, tremendously wealthy, a star athlete, and he was able to get away with a few things, let's keep it real. And it's because he had the money to hire proper representation. He lived a privileged life. And I feel like people do avoid talking about socioeconomic status when it comes to these complicated situations. Jody, what do you think?
Well, one of the sources of Jesse Jackson's statement that now he turns around and feels relieved when he sees someone white rather than black has to do with socioeconomics, because you take a group of people, you disproportionately concentrate them in desperate circumstances, it should sadden but not surprise you to find that they'll disproportionately turn to desperate undertakings like crime, like criminal behavior. Blacks do engage in disproportionate crime because they're disproportionately poor, and poor people disproportionately turn to crime. Right. And so there is a class component even to the legitimate statistics if we're looking at this as just a kind of profiling on the basis of rational statistic generalizations kind of argument, as against a unconscious bias, the kind of bias that you find in the 3-year-old little girl who said, Phyllis Katz in the New York Times some time ago described a 3-year-old little white girl who said to her mother upon seeing a black infant, "Look, Mom, a baby made." That 3-year-old girl isn't a racist. She's simply reporting on an association that's been forged in her memory between women from a certain social group and a certain social role that she constantly sees them in. She may become 18 and come to renounce that way of thinking about black women as appropriate, but that unconscious connection is still there to drive her perceptions, to drive her beliefs, and then make typical people respond differently to black people than to whites.
I wanted to say that specifically for that reason is why Question Bridge Black Male, which is a multimedia, arts initiative, was created to really get at those type of questions, to begin to represent, to allow black men and black boys to really represent and redefine themselves in the culture, and also, give an opportunity for larger society to see, black men from, different socioeconomic, backgrounds and, kind of cultural experiences, because there's this idea that, that black is a homogeneous group, as if, we're not Caribbean and African American and African, and I mean, it's this really kind of crazy idea that we bought into. But Question Bridge is essentially about black men having an opportunity to define themselves, and for larger society to be able to engage in a conversation and dialogue with us about what are our likes and dislikes, how do we see ourselves, how do we define ourselves, because we're constantly being defined in the culture and given labels.
What about the way black men are identified in pop culture? I mean, I feel like that I love rappers like Kanye West and Lil Wayne, and I feel like they're intelligent, and the audience is gonna go crazy because they love to hate on Kanye West, but he just recently released his album, or it was leaked, I should say, and he talks about private prisons, he talks about so many social issues and political issues that, people would not typically expect from rappers, but at the same time, you have the rappers like Rick Ross or whatever talking about, drugs and hoes and whatever it is. I mean, do you feel like that perpetuates the type of ideology that people have, or the thought process they have about black men?
It certainly feeds some of those stereotypes on the one hand. On the other, I'm not as hard on some of that as some, although I understand the criticisms and I can agree with some that we need to get rid of the misogyny and a lot of the other crap that's in some of this music. But on the other hand, we've often described these young black males who are caught up in the criminal justice system as a result of the crack plague as them. As Chris Rock says, I love black people, but I hate the N-word, or you have, Harvard Law professor Randall Kennedy said we need to distinguish between good Negroes and bad Negroes and put as much distance between them as possible. Well, here comes the so-called gangster rappers. That is, these young black men from impoverished circumstances, and they say, we have a perspective, we have a voice. Let me tell you about the world from our perspective. Let us, someone like Jay-Z, penetrate pop culture with the perspective of the young black thug, if you will, or criminal, and humanize them some. So I hear what you're saying. It's a double-edged blade. It feeds negative stereotypes on the one hand that can generate more of these typical responses that are negative.
It doesn't just feed it, though. I mean, most of it just engenders it. It's like a little mental program. You see, I live in Harlem on 144th Street, and you're walking down the street and you hear people reciting those lyrics, either from memory or when they're listening to their iPod, and it is like you're scared to death, because what they're talking about is stuff that they could be doing to you. It's just awful, disgusting, criminal stuff, and there's no responsibility at all, as far as the people who are putting that stuff out there. They have an opportunity to, in a mass media way, really put something out there that's a lot more aspirational and doesn't reinforce that kind of thinking, and then use it as an excuse by saying that it's expressing their reality. It really should be something that takes them out of that mindset and lets them think in a different way, but that's not what's happening. It's lowest common denominator stuff that just makes the situation last forever.
And
I think we're going to have to agree to disagree on that.
Yeah, because I think that a lot of rappers, they don't control any distribution networks. They don't determine what actually gets out there. They can produce it.
They wrote the songs, right?
Well, in some cases they wrote the songs, but believe it or not,
they said the words, right?
Corporate media. I mean, and would go in and tell them, hey, you need to change this, you need to change that, it needs to be more commercial. I've sat down with a high-powered music executive in the business who told me that piece does not sell. Okay, because his bottom line is...
Will Smith was pretty good at selling his piece.
Right.
I mean, when you really think about
but
it.
not as big as Jay-Z. 12 number ones in a row, leaving people like Elvis Presley behind, only the Beatles ahead of him. So it's a wildly popular art form.
But it's personal responsibility, right? You take the money, sell your people out.
Well, no, I don't. You say that. That's one way to characterize and interpret. Another way is, I consider what Tupac Shakur does to be very oppositional discourse and very valuable. And there's Pac, Nas, Big, Jay-Z, Ice Cube, America's Most Wanted, NWA, there was a real oppositional discourse there that was saying we're pushing back against this claim that all we are thugs and so much human toxic waste that needs to be dumped somewhere. So you can look at it both ways, and I think if you're really into the music, you're not going to write it off that readily. You have somebody like Nas, for example, saying, let's hear it too for the spooks who do cartwheels, because they said they played their part well. Now they claim caviar, hate that oxtail, lambda sigma phi badge on lapel. Why do you always tell them who he speaks so well? Are you the one we look to, the decent Negro, the respectable Negro? Hell no. But they say these are our heroes. That's a gangster rapper. Speaking about politics, if you're listening to the music, you're hearing that.
But what about all the pretenders who don't have that kind of social
Rick Rosses.
context?
I'm not endorsing the Rick Rosses. I need to agree with you on them. I need to agree.
I think, generally, and the executive producer's telling me I got to wrap up, but I do want to say one final thing. I think that you guys are both making great points. I think that there's powerful rap music out there that really does expose the realities that African American men face today in the United States. And then there is the garbage out there that talks about the hoes and the bitches, and it's not really my type of stuff. But anyway, with all of that said, we got to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about how we're using drugs as a scapegoat to avoid talking about poverty. Stick around. Welcome back to The Point. Later on today, I'm going to interview Dr. Carl Hart, and he actually wrote this really great book about the war on drugs and how we're using drugs as a scapegoat. Instead of talking about poverty and how poverty makes people do very violent and dangerous things, we're blaming it all on illegal drugs. Now let's go to a video where he explains this in further detail, and then we'll have a discussion with our panel.
The policy that's received more attention, particularly in the past decade and a half or so, has been the U.S. cocaine policy, the differential treatment of crack versus powder cocaine. Clearly, that policy is not based on the weight of the scientific evidence. That is, when the policy was implemented, the concern about crack cocaine was so great that something had to be done, and Congress acted in the only way they knew how. They passed policy, and that's what a responsible society should do. However, when the data started to come in and start to indicate that maybe the policy exaggerates the harms associated with crack cocaine, we should probably modify the policy. That never happened. And so my study of this area and my reading of this area and the study of other people's work has led me to come to that conclusion, that that policy is not based on the weight of the scientific evidence.
Dr. Carl Hart's book is High Price, a neuroscientist's journey of self-discovery that challenges everything you know about drugs and society, and I think that he covers something that's really important to talk about. We have drug policies right now that are destroying the lives of innocent people, nonviolent drug offenders, both white and black. So it goes beyond race when it comes to our ridiculous drug policies. So I love that he's drawing attention to it. But when you look at marijuana specifically, you'll notice that white people actually smoke marijuana at higher rates than black people do. But more black people get arrested and prosecuted for marijuana use than white people do. So these laws are also being used unevenly, and it's having a negative impact on minorities in the country. So Akila, first question goes to you. I mean, he makes the argument in his book, and I think it's a pretty controversial argument because it goes against everything that we've learned for so long. He makes the argument that a lot of these drugs aren't even really addictive. And, he mentions heroin and he mentions crack cocaine, and he says, I know it's interesting, but he says that there's very little scientific evidence to indicate that these are highly addictive drugs. But mass media and politicians will try to make it seem like these drugs are so dangerous because they want to use the drugs as a scapegoat for violent behavior, when in reality the violent behavior comes from poverty. Right. What do you think about his claims?
I think that his claims is absolutely correct. Mm-hmm. Now, heroin, crack cocaine, I'm not sure. I'm not a scientist. I haven't studied the drug to determine whether or not they're actually addictive. But, we've seen, I grew up in Watts, here in South LA, and I watched the crack cocaine trade, destroy my community like Hurricane Katrina. I mean, I truly believe that that the war on drugs has been a total failure, because ultimately, people don't use drugs because they want to. And drug abuse is not necessarily the problem. I think that it's a symptom of a deeper problem that's rooted in individual self-esteem and the disconnect in the personal life. And essentially, in my experience, it's been an indictment, of black folks. In many cases in our community who suffer, who don't have access to resources and opportunities, so people are going to do whatever they need to do in order to hustle and make ends meet. So all of a sudden, we have these ridiculous draconian laws that are giving people 50, 100 years. I have a brother who was serving a life sentence for conspiracy to sell drugs.
Oh my God.
Not caught with any drugs, not caught with any money, conspiracy, and got a life sentence. Okay, so it's I think that absolutely it's about poverty. In a capitalist system, poverty is planned and organized. So I think that that many of the statements that he make are absolutely true.
Bill, what are your thoughts?
First, was he saying that crack cocaine is not addictive or
He's
is
not
not
saying that
as bad as people say it is?
He says that he's not saying that it's not addictive. He says that it's being overblown. Like you'll watch the media and they'll say like you try the drug once and that's it, you're addicted for life. But he's saying that that's not necessarily the case, and they're trying to really amplify the negative impact of drugs instead of really focusing on what the real issue is, and the real issue is poverty. And I think that he does make a legitimate claim there, because I mean, I live a privileged life. I'm not wealthy by any means, but I have a job that I love. I grew up in a middle-class family, and there was never once a single moment in my life where I thought, you know what, I'm gonna try heroin, I'm gonna shoot up heroin. And a lot of times you see drug use, like heroin use or any of those hard drugs, happening in poor neighborhoods. And the reason why they do that is because of escapism. So you kind of have to discuss the issue of poverty as opposed to just pointing to something that people are using to alleviate the realities of their life. What do you think?
When you put together poverty and prohibition, you're going to get the crack plague and its festering aftermath. It's as simple as that. Anytime we've done prohibition, we tried it with alcohol, we put in a constitutional amendment. The alcohol was such a scourge. Forget crack, forget heroin. Alcohol was the real scourge. And it still is today. 30,000 lives are lost tragically.
And more lives are lost from smoking marijuana, right?
Right. No. That's the sad thing. We know that there's more social damage caused by alcohol than something like marijuana, but we single out, and it causes a loss of credibility to my kids. I have 3 sons, in that 18 to 22-year-old range, who have to sit back and say, now wait a minute, alcohol is causing all this social damage. You don't hear of people smoking a joint and wanting to go out and get into a barroom brawl. You hear about that all the time from Jack Daniels, and yet we're going to treat the marijuana so differently than the alcohol, even though the one is alcohol is so much more destructive than herb. And it just seems like a hypocrisy to my sons, and I can't explain it away for them either. I can't explain away the hypocrisy.
There was a report that research that was recently done that talked about like black boys 13 years old, 13% of black boys in middle school sell drugs, and that 13% of white boys in middle school sell drugs. However, 80% of black kids actually get prosecuted, black and Latino kids get prosecuted behind the selling of drugs and everything. So to me, there is absolutely a double standard in the culture as it relates to who gets prosecuted as it relates to drugs. And also I think that that there's drug use across the board. I mean, I think that people use just as much drugs in affluent communities than that are used in poor communities. The thing is how are the laws then applied to folks who live in a poor community versus an affluent neighborhood?
And also keep in mind that the charges for trying to sell crack cocaine, for instance, are very different from trying to sell prescription drugs illegally. Right. And I think that plays a huge role when it comes to socioeconomic status. So if you're from a wealthier neighborhood, you're more likely to do designer drugs, the pharmaceutical drugs. In poorer neighborhoods, you have, whatever, the crack cocaine, the meth, whatever it is. And for some reason, that has harsher punishments and harsher prosecution.
And you know what that reason is? It's the fault of the black community itself. I hate to say it. It's a fault of black leadership. In 1986, Len Bias died of a cocaine overdose. First time he tried powder cocaine, he had a cardiac arrest, and he was getting ready to go to the Boston Celtics and be the heir apparent to Larry Bird. There was all this consternation. How could this happen? This was within 6 months, they had a bill with Ronald Reagan sitting down, with members of the Black Caucus standing behind him, signing into legislation the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which for the first time imposed mandatory minimum sentencing. We tinkered with that in the late 60s and early 70s and gotten rid of. Introduced mandatory minimum sentencing and the 100-to-1 crack to powder cocaine disparity in sentencing. Those were black leaders signing off on that bill along with Ronald Reagan.
Wow. Wow. What do you guys think about mandatory sentences? This is the last question. Just calm down, Malcolm. Calm down. Last question. Bill, I'm going to go to you. What do you think about mandatory sentences for nonviolent drug possession?
I think the sentencing has to be situational, and I think if you're going to say that poverty is at the root of this stuff, you can't really. How do you? Underlying the poverty, I think, is education. I think that's the most critical factor there. So I think that's really where you have to focus. I don't think that there should be more uniformity in the laws. I don't think you can pot is one thing, crack is another. I think you have to be honest about that. And
do you think that people should be prosecuted for any drug use?
I think there should be an escalation based on how many times this is you're being caught. I think if I think that the three strikes paradigm makes sense.
Wow. Okay. You and I disagree a little bit on that.
I need to disagree.
All right.
Look, if I got caught doing something once, and someone says, you should not be doing that because this is the penalty, I'm not going to be doing that
I think
again.
it really depends on what the crime is. I don't think anyone should face any type of prosecution for drug use ever. I think that all drugs should be legalized, and if someone has an addiction, there should be help for that person to rehabilitate him or herself. But when it comes to violent crime, I might be more open to the idea of a 3 strikes and you're out policy.
In California, we're going through the largest criminal justice reform in the history of the state, with AB 109 and the realignment bill. And it's central to the conversation, this whole mandatory minimum sentencing. The Supreme Court just deemed that the California correction system was cruel and unusual punishment because all of the folks who are incarcerated, so many, the non-nons, folks who shouldn't be in prison in the first place are not getting the type of medical attention. They're in overcrowded institutions. So it's like we're warehousing people for drug crimes when they should be in community receiving rehabilitation and recovery services.
You're preaching to the choir on that one, believe me. All right, well, we gotta move on to the next segment before the executive producer kills me. So let's talk about Republicans. Republicans are trying to make it even more difficult for you to vote. Let's take a look at the video.
The U.S. Supreme Court on Monday issued a landmark ruling. The U.S. state of Arizona may not demand voters provide physical proof they're a U.S. citizen before casting a ballot. Citizenship is a requirement for voting in U.S. federal elections. Voters must answer under penalty of perjury whether they're a citizen by checking a box, yes or no. The Supreme Court says that's ample proof of citizenship. But Arizona disagreed and demanded documents from prospective voters. Campaigners say this led to thousands of people being rejected unfairly.
Arizona says its voting law was simply intended to cut down on election fraud, and it was backed by the U.S. states of Georgia, Alabama, and Kansas with similar legislation. But those opposed to the Arizona law say it was nothing more than a voter suppression tactic and are viewing the Supreme Court ruling as a victory.
Voter fraud was a huge story during the 2012 election. As you guys know, a number of states tried to pass laws that would address voter fraud. But when you really look into the statistics, you realize that voter fraud has never really been a big issue. So let me give you some of those statistics now. News 21, a Carnegie Knight investigative reporting project, found that 10 cases of alleged in-person voter impersonation happened in 2000. With 146 million registered voters in the United States, those represent about 1 for every 15 million prospective voters. There is more alleged fraud in absentee ballots and voter registration than in any other categories. The analysis shows that 491 cases of alleged absentee ballot fraud and 400 cases involving registration fraud. Requiring voters to show identification at the polls, the crux of most of the new legislation, would not have prevented those cases. And more than 46% of the reported election fraud allegations resulted in acquittals, dropped charges, or decisions not to bring charges. So as you guys know, voter fraud has never really been an issue, but it seems like Republican lawmakers continuously try to pass laws that make it even more difficult. You got to show your ID, you got to make sure that you show your proof of citizenship. But I have to say, in this particular case with Arizona asking people to show citizenship when they register to vote, it sounds kind of reasonable. Bill, what do you think?
As far as whether or not it's okay to ask for ID?
Yeah, what are your thoughts on asking people to prove citizenship when they apply or register to vote?
Well, my recollection is that I had to show some sort of proof myself when I first registered. I could be wrong, but I think every time I go, I have to show some sort of proof. I could be wrong, but I don't see anything so extraordinary about that myself.
So right now, if you register to vote,
but I think that what the problem was is that the Arizona was trying to set up a different standard than the federal standard, and I'm not sure what the difference was. But
okay, so let me explain what the standard is. If you try to register to vote federally, you promise, like basically you write under oath that you are a citizen. You don't have to show proof.
At no point do you have to show proof.
You don't show proof. No,
to register as a federal as a voter in a federal election.
In a federal election, yes.
In a federal election, you do not have to show proof. You sign under oath that you are a citizen. So obviously, if they find out that you lie, you face prosecution for that. Right. But in Arizona, they're like, well, we want more. We want to make sure that you do show proof. And as you guys saw in that video, the Supreme Court voted that that is unconstitutional. However, Scalia said that you can petition to a federal organization to make sure that they change their standards so you do show proof of citizenship when you register to vote.
So there's a way for Arizona to get what it wants anyway.
Exactly.
Well, that's how you win elections. You whittle down the electorate through taking away the franchise until all that's left are the people who are going to vote you into office, or at least a disproportionate number of the people left are the ones who are going to vote you into office. And you do it not only when it comes to Latinos, who, because of a lot of your policies, aren't that warm on your party right now, but you also do it when it comes to blacks. For example, black males. Once you're incarcerated, you can lose the franchise, which is kind of odd because you would think that you would want people to keep the franchise if their government put them in an institution, and they might want to change the laws that put them there. For example, during Prohibition, if you put me in the institution, I might want to elect politicians who are going to change the Prohibition laws. But you're telling me I can't vote now. I'm no longer a citizen. I'm no longer really an American in a significant sense. And so, yeah, this is not, it's not only there, but with the black prisoners, and in lots of ways, the effort to rig the system is unsettling.
I think that politics have consistently been about who doesn't vote as opposed to who votes. If they can keep the pool small enough, then they can always predict, who's going to win in any particular district or state, and so I'm consistently seeing that the law is, I feel like it's racist. I feel like it's totally racist. I feel like it's biased. Of course, I think that you should have to show ID and everything. But I think that the federal law already kind of states it. It's like, you sign it.
But the federal law says you don't have to show ID.
Well, you don't have to show ID, but you're gonna
accept you at your word.
But exactly.
Which I don't know. This society, it seems like quite a loophole.
Well, the thing is this: if they really wanted to go after you, and you signed this document and you're not an actual citizen.
And the reality is, we have undocumented immigrants in the country right now that don't even want to go to an emergency room. They don't want to get caught. So there's no way in hell they're going to risk getting caught just to vote in the election.
Is there any statistic on who the undocumented people are voting for, like who their preference is?
Well, they're more likely to vote for Democrats, which is why you have Republicans trying to pass laws like this to ensure that minorities don't actually go to the polls.
And are there any statistics on how many undocumented people are actually voting?
There are none.
None?
None. which shows you that this is kind of a non-issue, and that they just want to be. And by the way, the reason why this is actually going to have negative consequences is because how many people walk around with proof of citizenship? So it's actually going to make it much more difficult for people to register to vote. It's just creating another loophole that impacts minorities and Democrat voters.
People do have some form of ID. They don't have a citizenship, but they have a license, or they
That's
have their,
true,
or they have
but what
their
about
ID
areas
for other things, or they have their green cards. There's very few people walking around with no ID.
Think about New York. Think about New York City. Do you really need? You don't need a driver's license in New York City.
No one in New York City is walking around without some sort of ID, because you never know when you're going to need it. And let's say you get stopped and frisked or whatever. You don't have any ID. You need ID. You cannot leave your house without ID.
But some people,
I don't know anyone who does.
I do know people who don't. Elderly people don't have ID because they don't need ID.
My grandmother leaves with her Medicare card.
That's anecdotal evidence, though. That doesn't mean anything. There are statistics out there. I don't have the statistics in front of me, unfortunately, but there are statistics out there proving that elderly people do not carry ID, do not have ID, because they simply do not need it. So, and Republicans know that. Elderly people are more likely to vote for Democrats because Democrats are more likely, although it's a little different with the Obama administration, but more likely to make sure that their Social Security and their Medicare, Medicaid is intact. So that's
well, as an empirical matter, from the data that you just cited, there's not much evidence of this widespread fraud for this intervention.
I'm much more concerned about the electronic ballot box fraud, because that kind of tinkering doesn't get enough attention. You know, I think that's where the fraud is happening, because you don't know what is going on inside those boxes, who's controlling that, and it seems like wide open for some sort of
I mean, that's definitely a fair concern. But another thing I wanted to add was that a lot of college students also do not have ID. They might have their ID for their university or college that they're going to, but a lot of them live on campus. They don't need a driver's license. They don't need a state ID. So as a result, they don't go out there and get an ID until they get older.
Especially a lot of urban and like rural communities. You know, you got a lot of folks who are coming home from prison. I mean, it costs money now to get an ID. You don't get gate money no more. I mean, it's a real challenge. I know a lot of people who have no ID.
And in any event, the real issue here is, why are we treating one group of people differently than another? If the federal election law says you don't need to present this additional identification, why are we going to let certain states say, well, we're going to impose requirements over and above those of the federal system for no identifiable evil we can point to? We don't have any big crisis of fraud going on, and it's very transparently clear that it's going to hurt a certain demographic that isn't favorable to our party, and yet we're all going to pretend that this isn't going on.
There shouldn't be two standards. The federal standard should be the one standard, and yet asking for ID is not unreasonable either. You know, if that were if that were amended into the standard, I wouldn't have a problem.
I don't have a problem.
For ID.
So let me just clarify one thing. You know, in 2012, I didn't have a problem with people or politicians asking for IDs. But here's the thing: their timing was very, very convenient for the Republican Party. You have an election a few months out, and all of a sudden there are all these proposals for ID requirements. If you want the ID requirement, then you have to propose it years in advance, so you give enough people the opportunity to go out there and get their ID and get their proof so they can vote in the upcoming election. You can't do it a few months prior to the election. That's obviously a way to make sure that certain individuals do not get an opportunity to vote. All right, we got to take a quick break. Let's do that, and when we come back, Stephen Phillips, he was incarcerated for a wrongful conviction for 24 years. He got $6 million, and now his ex-wife is looking for some money. We'll discuss whether or not she should get a cut. Welcome back to The Point. Stephen Phillips was wrongfully convicted for 10 rapes back in the 1980s, and he served 24 years in prison because of that. Now that he's out, and now that he received compensation for spending so much time in prison, his wife wants a cut. Let's take a quick look at the video with more details.
Sometimes I would get up in the morning, and I would wake up and just greet the daylight, the dawn, and it was just pretty hard. Then I'd realize I'm innocent. I'm in prison for crimes I did not commit, and there's evidence substantiating that, and I'd taken on the responsibility of that evidence and that truth, and that was actually a hopeful thing.
Now, DNA evidence proved his innocence, and as I mentioned, he spent 24 years in prison for crimes that he did not commit. He was married to his wife for a little under 2 years before he got sent to prison. They had just started a business together. They had just had a child together. And after he got incarcerated, the business fell apart. His wife visited him for about 3 years, but 10 years after he got incarcerated, they decided to divorce. Now that he's been let out, the state has granted him $6 million. However, his wife feels that she deserves a cut of that money because of the fact that he was wrongfully convicted and sent to prison. As I mentioned, their business fell apart and it impacted her financially. So a court decided to award her $150,000, but Stephen Phillips is asking them to reverse that decision. He's appealing that decision, and the question is, should she receive a cut of that money? Jody, that question goes to you. What are your thoughts?
Well, you know, California is a community property state. So I'm accustomed to thinking about couples sharing the good times and the bad, you know, and they went through some very bad times. They were struck by a bolt of lightning. The state wrongfully convicted them, and she suffered. She had his child. She visited him. She remained married to him for 10 years. He had the comfort, at least in prison, of knowing that the mother of his child was on duty, was taking care of his offspring, etc. So I don't have any problem with this, I guess. At the end of the day, I know that a lot of people want to say, oh, well, she didn't do the time. Well, in a sense, she did do the time. When you have someone in prison, as some of us know, you do the time with them. You go through the pain and suffering. It may not be the exact same pain and suffering, but it's gut-wrenching. And so I don't have only $150,000 from a $6 million settlement?
Yeah.
What percentage is that?
Now, a huge part of me feels terrible for Stephen Phillips because as soon as he gets out of prison, all of a sudden the vultures start circling. So lawyers start, asking him for money that he doesn't feel he owes them. He has already spent $300,000 on legal fees after he got out of prison, and it's a really sad story because, come on, this guy was like wrongfully convicted and lost 24 years of his life. But Bill, I want to get your thoughts on it because you seem a little more skeptical, but I could be wrong.
Well, no, I think she deserves a lot more money. I mean, her life was completely destroyed, just completely destroyed. And she took it as long as she can. Then she divorced him, and then it turns out he was innocent. And I don't think she should be suing him. I think she should be suing the penal system. Absolutely. Should be suing the state. On the other hand, if she really wants to, earn that money, she might be willing to go in for 8 years herself, so she can, qualify for getting half of the settlement.
Would you serve a year in prison if you got for $1 million?
Yes, I would.
For $1 million?
I go in. Where? Come take me now. $1 million?
I've heard some horror stories about prisons, man.
I'm going to take my chances. $1 million. There's no way. There's very few other sure ways of getting $1 million at the end of the year. Let's do it.
All right, Akila, what do you think about this? Do you think she deserves $150,000, or does she deserve more?
I think she deserves $150 plus. I do a lot of work with the organization here in the state called Californians for Safety and Justice, and we have an initiative that's specifically focused on victims and survivors of violent crime, survivors of safety and justice. And we've through our work, have really expanded the definition around who victims and survivors are seen as, because most of the time we don't automatically think of the family of the victim as suffering. I mean, they experience all of the vicarious trauma and hypervigilance that the victim has suffered as well. And I think that she should definitely receive more than what she's gotten. And I think that also she should sue the state as well.
Now, one problem you point to is the more money, more problems, to go back to a rap reference, Biggie, Smalls kind of.
Do you want to wrap that one too?
I think I'll leave that one alone. But there is this kind of concern that, people are looking to hit the lottery at your expense using the legal system,
right.
and that there are vultures that are going to come after somebody who has wherewithal. And if this wasn't his wife who had gone through this with him, I might feel very differently about this.
I think her claim is legitimate because it had an impact on her, but I also think it opens up the floodgate because now anytime there's a wrongful conviction, it's going to be looked at as far as who exactly was impacted by that conviction.
Our legal system handles that with loss of consortium claims. We limit the number of people who can claim
right.
loss of companionship and affection. So it's typically only spouses and maybe sometimes children. Doesn't often go far beyond that nuclear group.
But why hasn't this happened before? Because I mean, I assume a lot of divorces happen with these kinds of sentences. So how? But is it unique that a conviction is overturned? In
the innocence. You've proven that he was wrongfully convicted.
That's the unique part.
Exactly.
Smoking gun.
Yeah. Right. All right, let's move on to the next story. So the Washington Redskins refuses to change its name. Is it racist, and what are the ramifications of such a name? Let's take a look at the video.
For any confusion there might have been about the Washington Redskins rethinking their team name, let it be known it's not happening.
They're not.
No, according to team owner Dan Snyder, in an interview with USA Today, Snyder says, quote, "We'll never change the name. It's that simple. Never." You can use caps. It's a strong statement given it's the first time team management has commented on the brewing controversy to change the name from what some say is offensive to Native Americans. Even D.C. Councilman David Grosso has waded into the football firestorm, pushing a proposal to see the name changed. Just last month, he told ABC7,
"This is an offensive, name, and that there's a lot of people in the world that find it that way, and that we have an obligation to change it."
But most football fans don't see it that way. A nationwide AP poll shows a whopping 79% of fans think Skins should stay. Many here in the district are in that category.
I don't think they should change it. I mean, it's tradition. It's where we grew up. It's how we know the team.
It's not offensive. It's traditional. It's an honor to bear an Indian heritage name.
I'm not going to buy anything that says Redskins on it. That's like having the N-word on it.
You know, back in the day, it was traditional to have separate water fountains for white people and black people, and then we kind of questioned that tradition, right? Bill, the first question goes to you. What are your thoughts? Are we being politically correct here in asking a football team to change their name and their mascot?
Well, I think it's interesting that, it's the Redskins play for Washington, D.C., right? That's the capital of the country that was stolen from the Redskins, from the Indians, right? So it's like just one insult on top of the other. And then they say that, it's a tribute to their bravery to the people that we almost wiped out. They gave a good fight, so we're trying to remember them. I mean, if you look at it that way, it's a lot like, there being a team in Germany called like the Berlin Hebes or something. They did what they could. But I think if you really look at it with historical perspective, it would make a lot of sense to cave into the political correctness.
I think the context is everything. Yeah, I mean, can you imagine the Wisconsin rabbis or something? Like it would be like I don't even know if that makes any sense.
It doesn't.
But your point is still, you guys get it.
Let's bring it to L.A. How about the L.A. Sambos? How would people feel about that football team? We've been wanting to get a franchise here. People would not take it. And you know why? I grew up at a time when I was in college. There was a Sambo chain of restaurants. They had over 1,000 restaurants running up and down the East Coast.
I saw one the other day.
They have one in Santa Barbara. That's the only remaining one. Because this is what happened. This is why we knocked it down to one from around over 1,000. There was a protest. In '79, you had a lot of black people starting to say in Connecticut and other places, I don't like the idea of a Sambo restaurant, every time that I have to drive by.
It's interesting that Santa Barbara is the one place left where the anti-diversity movement is strong enough to keep their Sambos.
That's insane. I didn't even know about that.
But what happened was the way they took on the Sambo name and the way you may have to do it when you're going after the Redskins is they said, we're going after your bottom line. You had city clubs in L.A., the California Club and the Jonathan Club, who excluded Jews, blacks, and women until the mid-'80s, when lawsuits and public scrutiny and licensing boards wouldn't grant them permits to sell alcohol. Take away the Washington Stadium's alcohol permit. See how fast they changed the name of the franchise.
I don't think they can trademark that name either because it's derogatory. So they can keep the name, but they can't trademark it. So like the government admits that there's an inherent problem. Is it?
If I'm not mistaken, I think that the Redskin name is trademarked, and it's one of the things that they're trying to do is to expand like the trademark so that anybody can actually utilize the name. And that would be one of the ways in order to kind of deal with the Redskins, defiance to changing the name.
What really disturbs me, I hate to say this, is in D.C., we used to call Chocolate City, large black population. You saw a number of black people saying, I'm okay with the name. I especially find it unsettling that black folks who've gone through this history as well of racism in America, Sambo and all kinds of epithets, would not be more sensitive to this issue and say, you know, there are two groups in this country that didn't come as immigrants. Everyone's always celebrating their immigrant status. The Native Americans and black people. You know, they were brought here in the hulls of ships, and one group was annihilated, and the other is now 90% of them in some inner city neighborhoods are in jail on probation or on parole at some point in their lives. So you would think that there'd be more sensitivity or hope.
Are there any Native Americans on the team?
I don't think so. Yeah.
I don't think so. That's a good point.
And so here's the question: who gets to decide what is and isn't offensive? So a clear case that comes up off the top of my head is a lot of universities will have like these themed parties, like they'll have a Mexican themed party where people wear ponchos or whatever, and they'll like kind of mimic, or I don't know if make fun of is the right way to describe it, but it seems like they're making fun of Mexican culture, but then they'll argue, well, no, we're celebrating Mexican culture. We like wearing the ponchos and we like eating burritos. And so that's what it's really about. And Bill, do you see that as something
Am I being
that's
profiled for this question?
Kind of, a little bit.
Because I'm Puerto Rican, you know.
Oh, really?
I got picked up in the wrong net.
Now I feel a little bad, but no. But what do you think? I mean, maybe there are Puerto Rican themed parties. I don't
think you know, if they're having a party like that and it's innocent, you know, I don't have a problem. As long as they don't have any like border security people taking people out of the party, then I think it's fine.
No, they'll have like a woman dressed as if she's like pregnant. Or
pregnant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, see, that's entering a different kind of territory.
Right, but then they'll argue
Is
like,
it her first child? Is she married? I mean, what are the specifics?
So how do you decide? How do you decide what's offensive or insensitive?
If I'm not invited, it's offensive. I would like to go and check it out for myself.
Those general issues about, you know, like the Confederate flag, you know, the N-word. You're right. It taps a whole. We have to think about language and word work very differently and figure out where we're going to draw the lines. It's a complicated issue. Doesn't lend itself to sound bites.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us, guys. Today was a rough show for me. It's been a really difficult week, but I want to thank you all for joining us. Dr. Jody David Armour, thank you for coming and sharing your point of view and also rapping with us. Where can our audience learn more about you?
USC website and Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, and have another book coming out soon.
Excellent. Akila Shirelles, thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Where can our audience learn more about your work?
You can learn more about my work by Googling me at Akila Shirelles, or you can look me up through questionbridge.com.
Awesome. And last but not least, Bill Santiago, you've been a trooper. You've had some disagreements on the show today, but I like it.
I don't remember any. I recall no controversy whatsoever. BillSantiago.com. I hope I can see some people at come out and check out a live show.
All right. And I'm Anna Casper, and you guys can check me out on the Young Turks Monday through Friday at youtube.com/TYT Live, 6 to 8 p.m. Pacific time. I wanted to make a special tribute to Michael Hastings, who was tragically killed in a car accident this week, and I did not expect to have such an emotional reaction to this, but he was a friend, he was a colleague, and he was an incredible journalist that I looked up to. Honestly, one of the most tragic things that I've experienced in my life, and my heart goes out to his friends and family. I mean, the only thing that I can really take away from this is just being inspired by the work that he did. He was truly fearless. He did not fear authority. He questioned authority. He held government officials accountable. And, you know, he will live on in my mind as one of the best journalists in my generation. So a special tribute to Michael Hastings. And for everyone else, have a good night, and we will see you next week.